So today's Friday. It is the history. We are moving now. We finished St. Patrick. Now we come to an important period of the church, which is under the two great saints, St. Gregory the Great and St. Benedict. So we're going to go over their lives here with William Thomas Walsh. And it's very powerful. The great question of St. Gregory's life and age was emphatically related in blood, the very year of his birth. Would the world be ruled by the northern barbarians, mostly foes of the Catholic Church, or by the decayed Catholic Caesars who still wielded the scepter of Constantine at Byzantium? On the answer which he must make would depend the fate of mankind for centuries. The choice was not easy. When the Roman Empire in the West came to its violent end in 476, only 15 years after the death of St. Patrick, the question seemed likely to be answered in favor of the Germanic hordes, some pagan, some Arian. And as the Arians hated the Catholic Church even more lustily than the pagans did, it must have seemed to an observer in Rome, reasoning from human premises, that the brief glory of that institution was about to be extinguished. While Catholics, remembering the promise of her founder that the gates of hell should not prevail against her, had little consolation but the knowledge that God would soon destroy the world rather than let her perish. So St. Gregory, he does write that the church seems like a battered ship full of holes and sinking. This is the state of the church. And we're in that again, aren't we? It's the same. We're in the same situation. On the other side, in favor of the church, must be reckoned the conversion of King Clovis. What country is he in?
France.
Who was founding the Merovingian power in the last valiant battles of King Arthur against the pagan Angles and Saxons in Britain. So for many years, the modernists and skeptics have been saying King Arthur was just a fictional character. But he's not. He really existed. And Chesterton says the proof he existed is everybody talks about him. And there's all legends about him, stories about him. And he's buried in Glastonbury Abbey. He's buried there. So King Arthur was not just this fiction. Go on, Michael.
I think I heard that they know he was a Catholic king because he was one of the graves that was desecrated during the Protestant Reformation in England, I believe.
Oh yeah, they desecrated his grave, the Protestants, yes. And many other graves of saints. And tore down statues. In Ely, E-L-Y, the town of Ely, there's a beautiful, unbelievable Catholic church. Built of stone in like the 900s or 1000s. Catholic, of course. And it has over 1,000 niches for statues, inside and outside. And all of them were yanked out, all the statues, except the very top ones they couldn't reach. It was built to hold thousands of statues of saints. And the Protestants wrecked it. So King Clovis in France, King Arthur in England. But British Catholicism was about to be extinguished, and the winning of the Franks must have seemed insignificant indeed beside the conquest of Italy by the Goths and the establishment, under Theodoric, of a strong rule and comparative peace that endured for 33 years. For Theodoric and his Goths were Arians, though they were Arians, even if his great minister Cassiodorus was a Catholic. Soon after the death of Theodoric in 526, the murder of his daughter Amalsuntha once more unleashed the devils of strife and famine and pestilence in the Eastern Emperor, as the Eastern Emperor Justinian declared war on guilty Theodahad and sent to Italy his general Belisarius. who had already saved his decaying power from the Persians and the African Vandals. The imperial army was pitifully small for the task. Yet such was his skill that in 336, after taking Sicily and storming Naples, he was made master of Rome. It must have been quite a temptation for a man of 31 when even his enemies offered to make him emperor of the West. But Belisarius remained loyal to the last, in ending a most brilliant campaign against odds with the capture of Ravenna and its Gothic king Vitiges. He made the stingy, vain, and calculating Justinian once more the undisputed lord of Italy. It was in that very year, 540, that St. Gregory the Great was born. 540, birth of St. Gregory the Great. High on the Clivus Scarus, or steep western escarpment of the Caelian Hill in Rome, where a few of the old aristocratic families still had their palaces. St. Gregory's family, which was of the illustrious gens Anicia, whence came Boethius, St. Benedict, and Pope St. Felix III, had a sumptuous mansion where marble colonnades and a lovely atrium enclosing the fountain where King Numa was said to have learned law and religion from the nymph Egeria. This became a holy well in the Middle Ages. All the other 6 hills, how many hills in Rome are there? The famous 7 hills of Rome, yes. All the other 6 hills of the ancient city had become uninhabitable for lack of water. Fetid marshes breeding malaria now lay under most of the unrepaired aqueducts, the last of which had been cut by King Vitiges in his futile stand against Belisarius. Owls nested in the sepulchral silence of the deserted capital and the crumbling heathen temples. So Rome was beaten up. Rome had been marched over by barbarians already. So Rome was in bad shape. On the Palatine Hill, which St. Gregory could see across the Appian Way, if his nurse Dominica held him up in her arms, the palace of the Caesars was a labyrinth of empty halls, and the entire hill was strewn, like the other 5, with shattered and headless statues, some toppled over in the weeds and rubble, amid beautiful old mansions deserted and falling to ruins. For as the most prosperous Romans had retired to the lower parts of the city, they had helped themselves to chunks of marble, parts of mosaics, and especially bronze ornaments to build or repair their new homes, and had left the 6 hills strewn with wreckage that well symbolized what had happened to them and their empire. From the windowless atrium of his house, St. Gregory could see also the baths of the Caracalla, where once some 1,600 Romans had lounged all day, recuperating from the debaucheries of the night. Now it was still roofed and quite imposing from a distance, but inside the green moss and rank weeds checkered the marble pavements of the dry and empty baths, and unmolested spiders dangled from the richly painted ceilings or spun their traceries over the dusty faces of forgotten gods. The darkened mass of the Colosseum was still in good repair, but was used only for animal shows and acrobatic performances and mimes. What's mimes?
The people who, the performers that
That
don't
they,
talk.
that they pretend, yeah, they don't talk and they pretend they're in
Right, yes.
something or.
And also the last gladiatorial games having been held in the year 404 AD. Grass grew on the arena of the Circus Maximus, and although two-faced Janus still kept his small bronze shrine in the ageless forum, His gates had been torn from their hinges during the various disturbances, and no one any longer consulted him on either peace or war. Among these crumbling antiquities, the Christian monuments in better repair seemed to hold forth some hope for the future. One of the first of these was St. Peter's, which Constantine had built over the grave of the apostle. Even the Arian heretic, Theodoric, used to hear Mass and to leave as an offering 2 massive silver candlesticks, while more recently Belisarius, in thanks for his victories, had donated a jeweled cross of gold. Yet outside the city, the more distant farmlands of the fertile Campania had become a wilderness of corpses and thickets inhabited by wild beasts and wilder men, closing in year after year upon the melancholy evidence of a departed glory and an ominous future. And sad-eyed merchants from Babylon, who were gaining control of all that was left of the commerce so neglected by the warriors of the West, thought once more with satisfaction that the thing their fathers and they had rejected was nearing its final gasp. So again, Rome is battered. St. Gregory's father, Gordianus, was a tall, serious man with a long face, a clipped beard, and thick, bushy hair. Though a lawyer and the owner of vast estates in Italy and Sicily, he seems to have been a decent sort of Christian and was highly respected as one of the 7 regionarii of neighborhood magistrates of the city. His mother, whom we venerate on November 3rd as Saint Sylvia, was a placid, amiable woman, probably shorter than her husband and rather plump. She was very devout and taught her son to share her love for the daily study of the Bible, which no doubt laid the foundations for his phenomenal knowledge of the subject in later years. For the rest, St. Gregory received the traditional education of an aristocratic Roman, save that for some unknown reason he never learned Greek. He was a good musician, and having an excellent memory, acquired a more than common knowledge of the Latin classics, logic, philosophy, poetry, and rhetoric. Together with the science of the time, he became a keen debater and eloquent orator, for his father intended him to be a lawyer and a man of affairs. The Rome of that day, like the Rome of ours, must inevitably have given a melancholy turn to a fine and sensitive mind, even one endowed with a sense of humor that flashes from the letters of St. Gregory. The first and most formative decade of his life was as ghastly as any in the history of the city. In 540, the year of his birth, the peasants of the Campania, whose fields had lain fallow for 2 years following the siege of Belisarius, were reduced to eating acorns and the bark and roots of trees. Many starved to death, leaving on the barren moors such dry and fleshless skeletons. Death, leaving on the barren moors, and that even the buzzards and vultures flapped by them to seek the better nourished corpses of fever victims in the city, especially when the great Persian plague swept over Europe in the year 542. In general, the Romans fared better than the farmers, getting their bread and games as of yore from the exarch of Caesar. On the other hand, they suffered cruelly from the license of the badly disciplined imperial garrison, which included Huns, Moors, Persians, Greeks, and Germans who had liberated them from the Goths. So, not too pretty a picture, is it? Rome's quite abandoned and starving people and plagues. And they often find that plagues were often caused by filthy septic situations. That's where a lot of the plagues originated, just filthy sewage, not buried but out in the open. In 546, when St. Gregory was 6 years old, the city was besieged by Totila, the cruel but not unchivalrous king of the Ostrogoths. At length inflation, the child of wars and mother of famines, laid a heavy hand upon the purses of the poor, A very rich man could afford to pay the equivalent of $150 or more in our money for a quarter of wheat. If he was a Christian, he might divide this with his poorer neighbors. If he was a pagan, he more often hid it away for his own family. Nor would he hesitate to pay a fantastic price for the carcass of a dog, a cat, or even a rat or two. Does that sound appetizing, Michael? What infuriated the starving poor was that the public granaries were stuffed with grain from Sicily, which the imperial commander Bessas would sell only at prices prohibitive to all but the most wealthy. Nor would he allow any to leave the city without paying him a generous bribe. It was actually a relief to most of the citizens when the scoundrel yielded the city to Totila on December 546. For if the barbarian had certain senators and well-fed leading citizens put to death, he at least gave stern orders that women were not to be molested. And although he had some fine old buildings burned, he had grace enough to desist when he received a desperate appeal from his old enemy Belisarius, who wrote from a sickbed, quote, "If you win the war, Rome will be the fairest jewel in your crown. If you lose, Rome spared will plead for your cause." So Totila had mercy on Rome, or what was left of it, and departed for Sicily. Sicily is the little island off the toe boot of Italy, right? In 549, he returned to the city. 3 years later, he was defeated and mortally wounded by the imperial troops of the shrewd little eunuch, Narses, successor to fallen Belisarius, and the only one who could get as much money as he pleased from Justinian. You always see these little eunuchs. They're always they kind of live up to their name, these little rat kind of creatures who are always involved with dirty deeds. You notice that? Like the eunuchs that St. Athanasius had to deal with.
Yeah.
With the wicked Eusebius. Yeah, these eunuchs are all kind of... And what's a eunuch? We don't have them anymore, except maybe... No. But eunuchs are castrated men. So they have high voices, they're effeminate.
They don't grow facial hair.
Yeah, and they look like women. so there are always these eunuch little rat characters, like little weasels, always involved with the dark stuff. That's what it seems to be anyway. The Romans, however, complained that Narses the eunuch was far more oppressive to them than the Goths. So, as you know, in the 1400s, music was such a big deal, and they loved the boys' voices. They wanted to keep their boys' voices high, so they castrated the boys. It had to be with the parents' permission, so they have a musical career. Can you imagine being one of these poor boys? But it was the Catholic Church that condemned that practice. Because it's mutilation. Mutilation is forbidden. So the Church forbade it. St. Gregory managed to survive all these events, and in the course of time, his studies having been completed, he became assistant to his father in aiding the poor and repairing the churches of the district of Rome over which he presided. He was still a youth when Gordianus died, leaving him the house on the Caelian hill and great estates in Sicily and elsewhere, together with another residence containing the fine personal library of a relative, Pope Agapitus. Pope Agapitus was a relative of St. Gregory. So he inherited his library. Other details of his early life are disappointingly lacking. He probably sailed a boat and had a passion for the sea. This, at least, is suggested by his fondness for similes and metaphors having to do with ships and other nautical matters. Nautical matters. What's that? What's nautical matters? Here's how it's spelled. N-A-U-T-I-C-A-L. What word do you see in there?
Sailor, Nata.
Yeah, nauta what?
Nata, masculine.
Masculine. Sailor. So nautical means having to do with sailing. Some have inferred from his lack of Greek that he had no worldly ambition and preferred only to serve his fellow citizens. That St. Gregory was popular and respected seems evident from the fact that as the obscurity lifts from his youth, we find him at 33 years old officiating in the important office of a praetor, or chief magistrate of Rome, and learned that people used to cheer when he appeared on the streets, draped in his consular trabea of silk, richly embroidered and sparkling with gems. So he was loved in Rome. St. Gregory was loved as an honest, good man and a leader. From a portrait made in his later years, it is evident that he was not so tall as his father, but had the same longish face, but whiter, and the same tawny thin beard and curly dark auburn hair. He was ruddy and even swarthy, his lips full, his chin prominent, his nose aquiline. Aquila in Latin is a eagle. So his nose was kind of like an eagle, with wide nostrils suggesting courage. His eyes a pale brown, somewhat small but kind. Such a man, if he had been a pagan or a careless Christian, might have been a great voluptuary, a soldier, a politician, a successful merchant. But by the grace of God and the examples of a pious mother, well, who's his mother again?
Saint Sylvia.
And a good father, he was what he was. And with the help of God, who brings good even out of evil, he reached his full spiritual stature under the influence of the rare spirit, whom we know as Saint Benedict. The impact of Saint Benedict's mind upon Saint Gregory's came about, strangely enough, in consequence of what seemed the black and utter evil of the Lombard invasions. The Italians, who had suffered so much from the Huns, the Vandals, the Goths, and even from the imperial liberators, now had to endure worse things from the cruelest of all the barbarians. These ferocious Germans, the Lombards, sometimes called the Bardi or Longobardi, had gradually forced their way from Scandinavia to the banks of the Danube, and thence, following the less hardy Goths, to Pannonia. There, after the deaths of Justinian and Belisarius in 565, they decided to help themselves to what was left of Italy. The eunuch, Narses, removed from his command, is said to have received from the new Empress Sophia a golden distaff, with the suggestion that since he was not a man, he might as well keep himself busy as a woman. So a golden distaff, that must be something to sew with, I suppose. Distaff. Distaff. Who's got the English dictionary? Michael, look up the word distaff. D-I-S-T-A-F-F. That's not a dictionary.
No, there's one, that blue one here, the big one here.
This one's on the end of the. I can get mine.
Okay, well, that's all right. His angry revenge was to invite the Lombards to cross the Alps and make themselves at home in Italy. This they proceeded to do, taking along as usual their women and children, and in 568 AD, under the king Alboin, A-L-B-O-I-N, they made themselves masters of a country too exhausted and divided to offer much resistance. So the Lombards just basically marched into Rome, into Italy. Nothing so much excited the rage and greed of these Arian Lombards as the Catholic Church. And in their hatred for the monastic life, which represented the fullest and most uncompromising expression of her teaching, they committed atrocities that made the depredations of the pagan Goths and Vandals look mild by comparison. Wherever they went, they slew monks or expelled them from their houses. One night in the year 572, they raided a lovely monastery of a new sort that had grown up in the solitudes of Monte Cassino, 80 miles from Rome. So who built Monte Cassino?
Saint Benedict.
Saint Benedict, yes. The abbot and his brethren, taking with them a pound of bread and a measure of wine each, managed to escape with their lives and to make their way to Rome, where Pope Pelagius II welcomed them. Footnote, a tradition not very well verified says that Pelagius had been a monk himself at Monte Cassino. So Monte Cassino is a hill. It's a huge hill, actually, and on the top is built this beautiful monastery. And it had to take a long time to build it. But that's where St. Benedict established. When you go there, you drive up and up and up. And there used to be temples to Apollo and some other pagan gods there. So when St. Benedict first arrived there, they were moving stone, and the monks couldn't move one of the big rocks. And even the toughest monks, it got 20 monks to pull it and put a rope around it and pull. Nothing was moving. So they called Father Benedict, St. Benedict, and they said, we can't move this rock. And he said, well, no wonder you can't. Look who's sitting on it. And it was a big fat devil trying to stop their progress. So it was St. Benedict who prayed to God. He saw in a vision that the barbarians would scatter his monastery. But St. Benedict prayed, Lord, at least spare my monks. So they would raid the monastery, but the monks would scatter, and a handful of them went to Rome, to Pope Pelagius II. And offered them land. He offered them land on which to build their monastery near the Lateran. Meanwhile, they found shelter in the abodes of devout Catholic families. It may be that the prefect Gregory was one of those who housed them, or he may have met them in the homes of his friends. At all events, there were 4 of them: Constantine, Honoratus, Valentinian, and Simplicius, who told him about the life at Monte Cassino and about their great abbot, St. Benedict, its founder, who had fallen asleep in death there only 25 years before. So who would write the life of St. Benedict?
Saint Gregory the Great.
Yeah, he will write it because he learns it from all these monks. All the miracles he did, the stories, etc. Now this is important to go into because St. Gregory the Great is the father of the Middle Ages, says St. Pius X. St. Pius X wrote a whole encyclical on Pope St. Gregory. Did you know that? St. Pius X wrote a whole encyclical praising St. Gregory the Great. Calls him father of the Middle Ages. So this is why it's important we study him. And St. Benedict, who is the father of monasticism, and he's the father of Europe. Because through the monks, Europe became Catholic. St. Gregory was so deeply moved, as St. Augustine had been, on discovering the life of St. Anthony by St. Athanasius. Here at last was what he had been looking for. Here was a man who had found the key to the riddle of existence, or rather had found a way to make the key of Christianity fit the door that pagan chaos had set up before it. He asked questions of these exile monks. He made many notes, and in the course of time he wrote the short but moving biography in the 2nd book of his dialogues, which is almost the only source of information concerning one of the most admirable and lovable men who ever walked the world, one who long after his death, with St. Gregory as his instrument and collaborator, was to change the very course of history. And who was this?
Saint Benedict.
The great St. Benedict, yes. So St. Benedict, he's powerful. His rule is the model of the Roman measure, balance, order, and right proportion. So the Benedictine monks were the ones who civilized all of Europe. There were the monks of St. Columban as well, but he was pretty wild. St. Columban was, he was Irish, so he had the Irish penance. He said the monks, St. Columban says in his rule, the monks should go to bed dead tired and should rise before they've had a sufficient amount of sleep. They were to sleep on boards, and their diet was, I think, meatless and very, very often fasting. So needless to say, most of the St. Columban monks died young. So what gave way was the wise rule of St. Benedict, which is very balanced. The monks get a bed. They sleep on a bed, not a board. They can wear boots. They have sufficient food to eat, and even more when they're working in the summer. And they even get a measurement of wine every day.
And then the sick monks are allowed to have meat if it's necessary.
Yeah, the sick monks and young monks, boys, were to have meat. So very balanced. So St. Benedict's rule ascended because of its good balance. And it made many saints. And it lasted because it wasn't overbearing. You could live it. It wasn't overly crushing. Like St. Columban's rule, where you drop dead with a plow in your hand. So let's look at the life of this great holy abbot, St. Benedict. Pope Pius XII called St. Benedict the Father of Europe. The Father of Europe. And we still live off the greatness of St. Benedict. And he prophesied that his holy rule and his monks, his order would last till the end of the world. Although at Vatican II and even before that, a lot of the Benedictine abbots went modernist. And they were the first to bring in the table and the new Mass and all that nonsense. So, St. Benedict belonged to the famous gens Anicia, whose profile ramifications included the Emperor Justinian, St. Gregory himself, and those accounts of Habsburg, who were to be ancestors of so many European kings. St. Gregory himself is our chief authority for the life of St. Benedict in the book 2 of his dialogues, The Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers, Volume 5. So that's the set I have to get a hold of. It's how much was it? $2,000 pretty much.
Yeah.
All this set of the fathers.
Yep.
Yeah, we're going to have to pray to St. Joseph for that. St. Benedict was born about 480 in the marble palace of Nursia. So this is St. Gregory. And before him was born 480 AD, St. Benedict. Born in 480 in Nursia. Sometimes it's spelled like this, Norcia. In Italy. His father, whose name was Euproprius, and his mother Abundancia, were Catholics. They had at least one daughter, her name Scholastica, said to be St. Benedict's what?
Twin.
His twin sister. Any of you have twins in your family? No? If their son had the education of most Roman boys, he was sent at the age of 7 to an elementary school where under a magister litarius, or literator, he learned the 3 R's. Which are what?
3 R's.
It's the 3 R's.
Religion, rhetoric.
Reading, writing, and arithmetic.
No.
Reading, writing, and arithmetic. Yeah. When he was 12 or 13 years old, he was probably sent to Rome with his good nurse, Cyrilla, Cyrilla, to enter something like a modern high school under a more advanced pedagogue called a grammaticus, grammar, who taught him Greek and Latin literature and rhetoric, after which he might hope to take a still higher course under a rhetor in all the arts of oratory and persuasion. So you always find rhetoric is part of the education in the old world in the high Middle Ages. So why is this important? Because logic orders the thinking in the mind. Rhetoric is passing that ordered thinking through the mouth. Logic structures the mind, so does grammar and Latin grammar, as you're discovering. And rhetoric is the ability to manifest what's in your mind in an orderly language. So you see the two go together. And that was a good education. So they could not only think straight, but they could communicate what they're thinking. That's an important thing, to communicate what one is thinking. St. Benedict never got that far. Perhaps the harsh routine of the Roman grammar school of that age was not the best incubator for intellectual curiosity. The pupils arrived before daybreak, carrying their own lamps or torches with them. Imagine young St. Benedict at 14 picking his way cautiously through the dark and filthy streets, stumbling over a broken statue or a fillet tossed on the pavement by a late reveler, like bones of a fish, now shrinking into the shadows to avoid some late brawlers, or hurrying on shamefacedly as some forsaken harlot called to him. The discipline in such a school was severe and inelastic. There were very few holidays and many floggings. So the boys misbehaved, whack. And they used to do that in most American public schools. There was still the paddle. If a boy was really misbehaving, he'd be sent to the principal's office. The principal had a paddle in his office. He would say, kneel down, or bend over, bam. You got to learn to be more respectful next time. This was just normal until the liberals got their way. Was there abuse? Probably in some places, but in most cases it was balanced. Men aren't there to beat boys. But to correct them, to help them be better. And the proof is, look at all the hard-working men and successful businessmen and farmers and families all throughout the 20th century. The backbone of the American military were the farm boys and boys who went through good education. So, anyway. So we'll pick up next time. We're beginning this beautiful life of St. Benedict. And we'll continue next time. Adjutorem nostrum in omni Domini.